The book of Job is the one book of the Bible that can make a Christian shrivel. When a skeptic brings up a question about Job, the average Christian usually sidesteps the issue or throws out an answer that is not satisfying. Because on the surface, the book of Job sounds terrible. It looks as though as if God tortures his most faithful servant on earth just to win a bet with Satan. How can we claim God is loving after something like that? However, that is just a surface understanding, and I want to show this is not the case. I personally used to be troubled by Job and avoided reading it altogether. But a few years ago, I became convicted about this. So I read it through and began to truly think about it. What I found is that this surface understanding was very false. What is actually going on is a deep message of love and a warning to Christians, or those who claim to follow God. I will not touch on the debate of whether Job is a work of fiction or literal history. Some scholars have argued it was composed as an ancient work of fiction and not literal history, sort of akin to Jesus' parables, meaning it is a story for teaching purposes, but not a literal historical occurrence. That is an interesting debate, but beside the point. If we focus on that, we miss the rich and deep theological teachings Job is trying to give us. What I want to show are three things. First, although Job was a good moral person, he had a warped view of God, which distanced him from God. Second, God had a good reason to allow what happened to Job. And finally, this book is not written to lost sinners, but is directly written to those who claim to follow God. It has a deep and important message for Christians today. First point, Job had a warped view of God. The first verse opens describing the moral character of Job. It says in verse 1, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil." Now the skeptic will say, see, he faithfully followed God. God had no reason to hand him over to Satan. But what the Christian should look at this description and say, so what? So what? Good works do not mean a person is following God. Doesn't Jesus and Paul teach that good works won't save us? You can live a good life and still completely miss the point of the gospel? Jesus says in Matthew 7:21-23, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness.'" Paul says in his letter to the Ephesians, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is a gift from God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." Just being a good person and doing good works doesn't mean someone is doing the will of God as Jesus says. And it would be helpful to compare this verse to another passage about a different righteous man in Genesis, named Noah. In Genesis 6:9 we read, "Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God." So if we compare these two verses, we see they are both blameless good men, but only one walked with God. The Bible teaches that being a good person is not enough, because Romans 3:23 says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. You can't earn God's salvation and blessings by works. Salvation is a gift by grace. It is about walking with God. Now, I'm not saying what Job was doing was bad. He was obviously doing good things. But we need to look past the action and look at the motive. And this subtle, yet important fact is missing from the moral description of Job. Okay, so what, the skeptic can say, this is just one verse. Well, let's keep reading. I want to look at a couple verses which individually may not mean much on their own, but together they can make a cumulative case. We get through the description of Job's wealth, and we are told in verse 5, "And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, 'It may be that my children have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts.' Thus Job did continually." This is another subtle yet important fact. Job is not relying on the relationship he has walking with God, but relying on the works and sacrifices he is offering up. The entire mindset implied is, what if my children die and they don't have all their sins paid for? God surely won't be appeased by that. I better make sure I do enough sacrifices so they can get into heaven. See, it's all about works. Job wants to follow God, but he thinks it's all about what he does to earn God's grace and blessings. It's not about walking with God like Abraham or Noah did. It is about Job trying to appease God with works and sacrifices. which, as Jesus points out in Matthew chapter 7, among other places, is missing the point. You can't buy your way into heaven. It's all given by grace. This is something Abraham understood. In Genesis 15, Abraham knew nothing of God, but he believed in him. And Paul tells us in Romans 4 that God counted him righteous because of his faith, not because of his works. But Job is not believing by faith, he is trying to earn it. Let's move on. We'll come back to the conversation between Satan and God in the second part. For now, let's look at how Job reacts when he loses everything. At the end of chapter 1, Job loses everything in a single day, his wealth and his family. Job's reaction starts in verse 20. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Now, this seems like a good moral thing to say, and many commentators have noted that. But for me, it seems a bit odd. By God's grace, I have never lost everything in a single day. But I can honestly say that if I did, this is not how I would react. My line of thought would be more like Jesus and what he yelled on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? I'd be yelling, God, why are you letting this happen? My reaction would be more like King Hezekiah in 2 Kings 20, as a cry out to God for deliverance. My reaction would be more like Jeremiah's in the book of Lamentations, as a cry out to God of the horror that happened and question what is going on. It would be very hard for me to say, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. In fact, it would be very hard for me not to talk to God and only talk about him. In fact, throughout Scripture, when something bad happened, the man or woman of God cries out to God for help. They don't usually talk about God like Job does here. So the interesting thing we need to note is Job doesn't address God. He talks of God. He doesn't say to God, you gave and you take away, but I'll continue to bless your name. If he walks with God, why not talk to him? So what does this mean? There is a misguided belief in America called the prosperity gospel. Those who hold to it believe they can claim whatever they want by faith. If they want a new car, then they just say, I claim a new sports car in the name of Jesus. And they believe God is getting them the new car. I wish I was making this up, but it is sadly true. It doesn't appear that they walk with God. They try to use God to get the things they want. Job's line of thought seems to be similar to that. That as long as I bless God, he will have to hear me and reward me by fixing this. It's not about crying to God for help, but crying out so God will hear him and see how good he is being, and follow through and reward that. This implies little evidence of a personal walk or relationship with God. It seems to be all about trying to appease God so he will fix the situation. Let's keep going. We're looking at pieces in the text to get a bigger picture of who Job was. Things get more interesting in chapter 2. Satan comes back, and this time causes Job to be covered with painful sores. Then his wife said to him, Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now look at that last part in verse 10. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. That is interesting because in chapter 1, after the turmoil hits, it says, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. We see it goes from Job not charging God to Job not sinning with his lips. Why the change? Why not just repeat the same phrase that Job did not sin or charge God with wrong? Because something different has happened in Job, and we see that come out in chapter 3. Now, Job's friends show up and they watch him suffer for 7 days, until finally Job says in chapter 3, Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, A man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it, and so on and so on. Job goes on for the rest of the chapter wishing for death, wishing he had never been born. He speaks as if he loves death over life, and there is more speaking about God and not speaking to God yet. It's as if Job is writing a love letter to death. But see, that is interesting because Proverbs 8:36 says, in speaking about the wisdom of God, All who hate me love death. The Bible teaches God is life, and to reject life and want death is to reject God. So let's go back to this comparison between these two verses. Job at first will not sin or charge God, but later it says Job will not charge God with his lips. or in other words, he will not openly speak what he feels in his heart towards God. At this point in chapter 2, he has hate towards God, and it is obvious in his wish for death, because all who hate God, who is life, love death. But Job won't outright say it. Why? If that is what he feels, then why not admit it? If Job walked with God, why isn't he just being honest with him like Hezekiah, Jeremiah, or Christ did? Why is he hiding what he feels? Because Job still thinks his entire good fortune was built on appeasing God. God for Job was a giant genie in the sky, or a divine vending machine. As long as Job says the right prayers, does the right sacrifices, says the right things, then God is expected to bless him. Following God was not a relationship, like with a fellow loved one, but was a formula. A good God plus doing good works equals a good life. As long as he did his part, God was expected and is supposed to do his part and make him happy and fill his pockets. But it was all about Job. God became a means to an end. Someone like Job would be using God to get the things he really wants and not God himself. This is clear in chapter 1. Job doesn't cry out to God for help. He tries to appease God by blessing his name. In chapter 2, his wife says he should curse God and die, which again implies it's all based on works. If you do something bad like cursing, you will get bad back from God. But Job doesn't do that, even though he feels it. Instead, he is trying to appease God somehow for the time being by saying good things and not cursing God. With this mindset, it seems as though as if he thinks he can earn God's favor again and get back his old life, which is why he won't openly say what he feels in his heart. But after 7 days and trying to deal with his circumstances while not cursing God and still trying to show his goodness, Job finally starts to admit what he feels. He gives up, and quite frankly says, "The formula is not working. It's broken. I'm doing the right things, but the divine genie is not giving me what I deserve for persevering, so just let me die." Now, I'm not saying all of Job's lamenting was not crying out to God. After this initial response, he definitely begins to cry out to him, but we are looking at how he initially handles the situation, as that will reflect what he thinks is the best way to handle the turmoil. Once that doesn't work, then we see he begins to look elsewhere and cry out to God for help and answers. However, the point here is he initially doesn't do that, which I will argue in a bit is what God was trying to get at. Now, if you need any more convincing, look at how Job's friends treat the situation. They tell him over and over he did something wrong and he needs to repent. A good God plus bad works equals a bad life. Job did something wrong and he needs to fix it so he can earn God's blessings again. God will even bless him with riches if he does and says the right things, which is very similar to the prosperity gospel. So the important thing to remember about this is people tend to hang out with other like-minded people. Your close friends are usually those who you agree with most. And in ancient cultures, this was even more likely, with much more racism and class segregation. Those who came to see Job are his closest friends. Now, are you going to suggest that Job didn't think at all like them before this happened? We tend to draw closer to the people we think more like. And so Job's friends are telling him the core doctrine of their shared beliefs. You obviously must have messed up, Job, or this wouldn't have happened. You must have said the wrong things, or acted wrong, and this is why the divine vending machine has spit back at you. Job had the same idea in his mind, but the opposite look, since he claims he should have earned the good life. Look at Job's final confession, which resonates through the rest of his lamenting. In chapter 29, Job lists all his good works. I delivered the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to help them. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and so on and so on. Then in chapter 31, he denies having done anything wrong. In both of these chapters, he points out he is blameless in both areas. He never coveted another woman, harmed servants, or forsook the less fortunate. He talks about his morality, sexual purity, generosity, benevolence, truthfulness, etc. He abstained from all sins such as lust, greed, envy, deceit, vengeance, and violence. Job was a blameless man, and he had the list to prove it. And that is exactly the problem. Nothing in his list mentions faith in God or trust in him. Nowhere does he say he trusts in God's control, but he clearly shows he has faith in his own works, which should have delivered him. His work should have been his ticket to why he deserved the good life. He doesn't even hint at the possibility of some imperfection, or that he didn't do what was needed to earn the good life. In other words, Job's report was accurate, but it reflected a mindset of justification by works. A good God plus good works should guarantee a good life. If anybody could have boasted in the law, it was Job. His criteria for righteousness was entirely self-made. He had become his own God and thought he was earning all that he had. Job had this warped view of God, which was, as long as Job played by the rules, God was expected to bless him. It wasn't about a relationship with God, but was about Job's works and using that to get God to give Job what he really wanted. Job was not following God, but his own moral deeds. That is what he thought was blessing him, not God. Job was lost in moralism, the idea that one can earn their way into God's grace and blessings through moral deeds.